June 14, 2026, 11:47 p.m. A satellite communications relay center in Russia's Volga region sits dark against a cloudless sky. 43 technicians are on duty. Encrypted traffic from 3 southern fronts flows through antenna arrays that stretch 60 meters above the steppe. Russian commanders rely on this facility for every order, every coordinate, every encrypted channel update across the Zaporizhia axis. From the outside, it looks like almost nothing. A cluster of low reinforced buildings behind a perimeter fence. Security lighting casting orange pools across gravel access roads. A small administrative block where the duty officer keeps his logs. Nothing announces its importance. That invisibility was, for months, its best protection. At 11:51 p.m., the first Ukrainian drone crosses into Russian airspace, 1,400 kilometers from the front line. The technicians have 4 minutes left of normal life. This is the story of one of the deepest long-range strikes Ukraine has ever executed. Not a HIMARS volley at a logistics hub 40 kilometers back. Not an FPV swarm against a tank column in Kherson. This was a surgical strike carried to the edge of Russia's heartland, against a facility Russian planners assumed was untouchable. One that had routed tactical communications for months while Russian commanders slept, convinced that distance was protection. They were wrong. What Ukraine's long-range strike planners built over 6 weeks of intelligence work, they delivered in 93 minutes of execution. I'm your host at War Vector, where we analyze the battles that change wars. And this one changed something fundamental about where Russia can feel safe. The facility targeted that night was not a headquarters, not a command post in the traditional sense. It was infrastructure. The kind of target that modern armies guard with layers of redundancy and geography, on the assumption that an adversary without meaningful long-range land attack capability could never reach it. Russia built its southern communications architecture on 3 assumptions: distance, depth, and dispersion. Ukraine's planning cell spent 6 weeks dismantling all 3. To understand why this target mattered, you have to understand what it did. The Volga Region Relay Center was not simply a radio tower. Ukrainian signals intelligence, working alongside partner agencies that won't be named in open sources, had built a picture showing that this facility was actively routing encrypted command traffic for Russian groupings across the Zaporizhia and Kherson axes. Ukrainian General Staff reports from the spring of 2026 noted repeated pattern correlations. Whenever Russian tactical units executed coordinated maneuvers along the southern front, the bandwidth signatures from this facility spiked. Consistent, repeated, and after 6 weeks of observation, actionable. What's most surprising about this target selection isn't the distance, it's the patience. Ukrainian planners watched this facility for 43 days before they moved. 43 days of signals collection, pattern analysis, and schedule mapping. They needed to know not just where the facility was, but when it was most vulnerable, and how its operators behaved during a crisis. The obstacle that nearly derailed the whole operation arrived on day 31. A Ukrainian SIGINT collection asset in the region went offline. Equipment failure at the worst possible moment. 3 weeks of schedule mapping depended on that asset's data feed. For 72 hours, planners worked with degraded data, running correlation models on what they already had. The gap was bridged by a secondary collection method that Ukrainian sources haven't publicly detailed. But the schedule map survived. The 90-minute rotation window, the gap between Russian duty crew changeovers when the facility was statistically most vulnerable to confusion and delayed response, remained valid. The strike window was set for 11:47 p.m. local time on June 14, 2026. Not arbitrary. Russian duty crew rotation records, reconstructed from intercepted administrative traffic, showed a pattern. Shift handover at roughly 11:30 p.m., with the outgoing crew typically remaining on site for about 20 minutes before departing. The incoming crew, fresh but not yet fully synchronized with the operational picture, would be at peak cognitive load during their first 30 minutes on duty. Ukrainian planners placed the first impact inside that window deliberately. There's a line from the intelligence assessment that reportedly circulated among the planning cell. Ukrainian defense media published fragments of it in the days after the strike. The facility's operators fear missiles from the south. They do not look east. That single sentence captures the core of the deception architecture that made this operation possible. The strike package had three components. The first was a decoy wave, a coordinated flight of modified Ukrainian long-range drones dispatched from positions in the northwest, not to strike the facility, but to trigger Russian air defense radar emissions along the anticipated approach corridor. Russian S-300 and S-400 batteries in the Volga region would detect the incoming drones, activate their acquisition radars, and in doing so, illuminate their own positions. Ukrainian electronic warfare systems, orbiting at standoff distance, would map those emission signatures in real time. The decoy drones would be engaged and destroyed. That was expected, planned for. Their only job was to make Russian air defense show itself. Which weapon platform was most decisive in this operation? The decoy drones that mapped Russian air defenses, the storm shadow derivatives that executed the strike, or the 6 weeks of signals intelligence that made targeting possible? Comment below. Every answer reveals something different about how modern deep strike warfare actually works. The second and third components were the strike missiles themselves. Ukrainian sources describe them as storm shadow derivatives. The Franco-British cruise missile, with a range exceeding 560 kilometers, adapted by Ukrainian engineers for extended range profiles through a combination of fuel load optimization and trajectory planning that keeps the weapon low and radar elusive across most of its flight. Ukraine has been receiving Storm Shadow missiles from the United Kingdom since 2023, and by 2026, the platform was deeply integrated into Ukrainian long-range strike doctrine. But reaching 1,400 kilometers required something beyond the standard configuration. Here's the part that doesn't add up on the surface. Storm Shadow's nominal range is approximately 560 kilometers. The target was 1,400 kilometers from Ukrainian launch positions. That gap isn't bridged by better fuel alone. What Ukrainian planning did was treat this not as a single launch problem, but as a trajectory architecture problem. Missiles launched from positions inside Ukrainian-controlled territory, following routes that exploited terrain masking and radar shadow zones identified through the decoy phase, could extend their effective operational reach significantly beyond standard range figures once the target's air defense environment had been pre-degraded. The decoy phase was not a distraction. It was the mechanism that made the missiles survivable at extended range. Stay with me. What happens in the next 18 minutes is going to reshape how you think about modern long-range strike doctrine. And it ends with a Russian communications facility going dark in a way that took their engineers 48 hours to partially fix. The first missile departed its launch point at 10:19 p.m. At cruise altitude and speed, it would cover its designated approach corridor in approximately 92 minutes. The second launched 11 minutes later on an offset vector, a different approach axis designed to arrive from a bearing that Russian air defense operators would not be covering after engaging the decoy wave. The third missile, targeting the facility's backup antenna array rather than the primary structure, launched at 10:41 p.m. All three weapons were in the air simultaneously before any Russian radar system had detected any of them. Russian air defense in the deep rear operates on a different tempo than forward-deployed systems. Forward batteries are at continuous high alert. Rear area batteries run on rotation schedules, with crews managing fatigue across 12-hour shifts. The Volga region air defense architecture in June 2026 reflected this. Competent, equipped with capable systems, but operating with the institutional relaxation that comes from believing threats cannot reach you. The decoy wave shattered that assumption at 11:39 p.m. when the first drone signatures appeared on Russian acquisition radars. 3 S-300 batteries activated. Their radars lit up across a 40-kilometer arc. Ukrainian electronic warfare systems, monitoring from outside engagement range, cataloged every emission, frequency, power, azimuth, elevation. The batteries engaged the drones, several were destroyed. Russian operators reported successful intercepts to their command chain. The outgoing duty crew at the communications facility, watching their screens, saw what looked like a standard air defense engagement. Nuisance drones, handled professionally. They logged it and continued their handover briefing. The incoming crew took over at 11:31 p.m. They received a handover that included a note about the air defense engagement to the northwest. Nothing unusual. The system had performed correctly. They settled into their stations. Inside the facility at that moment, the atmosphere was routine. The crew supervisor, 26 years old, 18 months into his posting, ran through his standard checklist. Antenna array status, nominal. Power feeds from the primary and backup generators, nominal. Encrypted traffic loads across the 3 southern channels, elevated but within normal parameters for a Sunday night operational cycle. He initialed his log and poured a cup of tea from the thermos his wife had packed that morning. 43 technicians, 1 facility, 119 kilometers of step in every direction. He had no reason to feel anything other than the mild boredom of a quiet watch. Here's what none of them knew. The air defense batteries that had successfully engaged the decoy drones were now, in several cases, reloading or repositioning. Their radars, briefly shut down to avoid counter-radiation missiles during the engagement, were coming back online in the sequence their operators preferred, a sequence Ukrainian planners had mapped across 43 days of pattern analysis. There was a radar coverage gap, not large, not long, but real. And the 2 storm shadow derivatives, flying offset vectors that the decoy phase had already validated as viable, were 37 minutes from impact. At 11:44 p.m., a Russian long-range radar system in the region acquired an anomalous contact at the edge of its detection envelope. Fast, low, moving on a bearing that didn't match the earlier drone engagement. The operator flagged it. The report moved up the chain. Russian Air Defense Command began calculating an intercept solution. The first missile arrived at 11:51 p.m., 4 minutes early, relative to the planning timeline. A product of stronger than forecast tailwinds across the final approach corridor. The warhead, a broach-penetrating munition, impacted the primary antenna array building at roof level and continued through 2 floors before detonating. The shaped charge precursor opened the structure. The main warhead detonated inside. The explosion was observed on commercial satellite imagery reviewed by OSINT analysts in the 48 hours after the strike. The primary structure of the antenna building was completely destroyed. Ukrainian General Staff released a damage assessment noting that thermal signatures consistent with electrical fire were visible for approximately 6 hours after the strike, suggesting secondary damage to the facility's power infrastructure. The Russian duty crew had 34 seconds of warning. That's what the radar detection to impact timeline reconstructed from intercept data suggests. 34 seconds. Not enough time to execute emergency shutdown procedures. Not enough to route critical traffic to backup systems. Enough time for the incoming crew supervisor, 21 minutes into his shift, to initiate an emergency alert that was still transmitting when the primary power went down. The second missile arrived at 11:55 p.m., on schedule. Its target was the facility's satellite uplink cluster, the arrays that maintained connectivity to Russian military communications satellites. Combat footage verification from Ukrainian drone surveillance assets operating at the edge of the engagement area, reviewed by multiple OSINT investigators, shows the second impact on the eastern side of the facility compound. The satellite uplink infrastructure, partially shielded in a reinforced structure, was assessed as significantly damaged, but not completely destroyed. That turned out to matter, because the backup systems, the fallback communications architecture that Russian engineers had built into this facility to survive single-weapon strikes, began attempting to restore some connectivity within roughly 20 minutes of the first impact. Ukrainian planners had anticipated this. The third missile had been targeted specifically at the backup antenna array. How many distinct strike packages did Ukraine coordinate during this single operation? Take a moment. The answer: 3, each targeting a different component of the facility's communications architecture, reveals the depth of the intelligence preparation behind this strike. We'll come back to the full breakdown at the end. The third missile arrived at 11:58 p.m., 7 minutes after the first impact. Russian technicians who had survived the first 2 strikes were still reporting initial damage assessments to their command chain when the third warhead detonated against the backup array structure. Post-strike satellite imagery, analyzed by organizations tracking the conflict's infrastructure damage, confirmed that the backup antenna array was destroyed with a degree of structural completeness that suggested a direct hit on the most critical component of the secondary system. In the immediate aftermath of the third impact, the facility grounds were a scene of controlled chaos, edging toward collapse. Emergency lighting had failed along with the primary power grid. Technicians were evacuating through smoke-filled corridors using handheld flashlights, some still clutching logbooks and portable communication devices, in the instinctive response of men trained to preserve equipment before themselves. The duty officer had managed to transmit a fragmentary emergency report to regional command before the last relay link dropped. That report, 4 sentences, partially garbled, was the last confirmed outbound communication from the facility for 41 minutes. Russian engineers dispatched from a regional maintenance depot would not arrive on site until well after 3 a.m. Subscribe to War Vector if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Not the version that gets cleaned up for briefing slides. The version that happens at midnight in the Volga region, when a communications facility that was supposed to be safe finds out that distance is not the same as security. At 12:03 a.m. on June 15, 2026, Russian military communications across 3 southern axes went dark. The degradation was not complete. Russia's communications architecture is layered, and no single facility is the only path for any given traffic stream. But the Zaporizhia axis experienced what ISW's June 2026 assessment described as notably degraded command coordination in the 48 hours following the strike. So Russian units that had been receiving timely encrypted updates on Ukrainian positions and intentions found themselves operating on delayed, fragmented, or absent information. The impact showed in operational behavior. Russian forces on the Zaporizhia axis conducted significantly fewer coordinated maneuvers in the 72 hours following the strike, compared to the preceding week. Russian military bloggers, whose commentary serves as an informal real-time indicator of force morale and situational awareness, acknowledged a technical outage affecting communications in 3 regions, which, in the coded language of the Russian military information environment, was a significant admission of operational disruption. What stands out about this operation is what it reveals about the shift in Ukraine's strategic approach through 2025 and into 2026. Early in the war, long-range strikes were largely reactive, responses to Russian missile attacks, attempts to disrupt logistics and ammunition supply. By mid-2026, Ukrainian long-range strike doctrine had matured into something different: proactive, intelligence-driven, targeting the nervous system of Russian operational coordination, rather than simply its hardware. The question this raises for Russian military planners is where the new safe distance is. Because whatever the answer was before June 14th, it changed that night. If you think modern warfare is as much about information architecture as it is about weapons platforms, type War Vector in the comments, because that's exactly what this strike was about. Not destroying tanks, destroying the system that told the tanks where to go. Here's a take that may generate some friction. Russia's fundamental miscalculation in this case was not tactical, it was institutional. The assumption that the Volga region was beyond meaningful Ukrainian strike reach was not a failure of intelligence analysis. Ukrainian capabilities were, by any reasonable external assessment, unlikely to produce this result before it happened. The failure was of a deeper kind. the organizational inability to treat low-probability, high-consequence threats as planning requirements rather than planning exceptions. Russian air defense in the deep rear was not built to stop this strike because Russian institutional culture had not authorized the budget, the attention, or the operational tempo required to do so. That's not a Russian peculiarity. Every military establishment in the world carries some version of the same vulnerability. The facility that gets struck is always the one that fell below the threshold of credible threat. Put yourself in the position of the Russian facility commander at 11:47 p.m. Your air defense has just successfully engaged a drone wave to the northwest. Your incoming crew is settled. Your systems are nominal. You have 43 technicians routing communications for 3 active fronts. There is no rational reason, based on what you know and what your system has told you, to expect the next 11 minutes to end the operational life of your facility. That is the nature of the threat Ukraine built. Not overwhelming force. Precision exploitation of a planning blind spot. What would you have done differently, with the same institutional constraints and the same threat picture your command was working from? Will Russia be able to harden its deep rear communications infrastructure sufficiently to prevent a repeat of this type of strike within the next 18 months? Comment yes or no, because the answer shapes everything about what the next phase of this conflict looks like. The intercepts that filtered through Ukrainian defense media in the days after the strike included fragments of communications between Russian field commanders and higher headquarters attempting to work around the coordination gap. The picture they paint is one of improvisation under pressure. Commanders who had grown accustomed to seamless encrypted coordination finding themselves working on degraded channels, with delayed confirmation cycles and fragmentary situational awareness. One intercepted exchange, published by Ukrainian defense media and assessed as credible by multiple OSINT analysts, included a senior officer asking his subordinate whether a specific coordinate package had been confirmed through the normal channel. The subordinate's response indicated it had not. The action, a scheduled artillery preparation, was delayed. Something about that exchange stuck with me. Not just because of the tactical detail, though that's significant. It illustrates the human reality behind infrastructure targeting. Every minute of degraded coordination is a minute in which Ukrainian defensive positions have slightly more time, slightly better odds, slightly more space to maneuver. The cumulative effect across 48 hours of degraded coordination along the Zaporizhia axis is not easily quantified, but Ukrainian units operating in that sector in the days after the strike reported reduced Russian combined arms pressure. The correlation between the strike and the operational pause is, as ISW's assessment noted, notable. The facility has not resumed full operations. Russian engineers have been working to restore communications routing through alternative nodes, and partial capability has been reconstituted through redundant systems that were not located at the Volga site. But the primary facility's antenna infrastructure, as assessed through commercial satellite imagery available through late June 2026, remains non-operational. The reconstruction timeline, based on the scale of physical damage visible in imagery, suggests months rather than weeks before full capability could be restored, if Russia chooses to rebuild on the same site, which carries its own risk calculus. Here's what NATO planners reviewing this strike will study. The operation validated a specific doctrinal approach, the use of a decoy wave not to overwhelm air defenses numerically, but to trigger them into revealing their positions, geometry and operational patterns, in a way that creates exploitable coverage gaps for following strike packages. Not a new concept in air campaign theory, but it's a concept that has rarely been executed with this degree of precision at this range, with this small A-strike package. 3 missiles, 1 night, 1 facility destroyed. The take that textbooks will eventually settle on. Ukraine did not win this operation on the night of June 14th. Ukraine won it on day 31, when the SIGINT asset failed and the planning cell built a bridge across a 72-hour data gap, using secondary collection methods rather than abandoning the targeting cycle. Persistence in intelligence preparation is not a romantic military virtue. It's a technical discipline that produces results like this one. The answer to our earlier question. Ukraine coordinated 3 distinct strike packages in this single operation. Package 1, the decoy drone wave, was not a weapon in the conventional sense. It was a sensing instrument designed to illuminate Russian air defense positions and create the radar coverage gap that the following packages needed to survive. Package 2 was a single storm shadow derivative targeting the primary antenna array and communications building, with the Broach warhead selected for its ability to penetrate reinforced structures before detonating. Package 3 targeted the backup antenna array, time to arrive as Russian technicians were still assessing the first 2 impacts. The sequencing was deliberate. Each package set the conditions for the next. Was the decision to use 3 separate strike packages rather than a single larger salvo the right call? A single larger salvo would have offered greater probability of defeating air defenses through saturation. The 3-package approach provided something else: optimized targeting of specific facility components, with the decoy phase serving as an active enabler rather than a wasted expenditure. The Ukrainian planning cell chose precision over mass. The battle damage assessment suggests they were right. Could Russian air defense have prevented this strike with different operational posture? Theoretically, yes. A fully alert, fully redundant air defense network, without the radar coverage gaps created by the decoy phase engagement, would have presented significantly greater obstacles to the storm shadow derivatives. In practice, the decoy phase was specifically designed to create those gaps, and 6 weeks of pattern analysis gave Ukrainian planners enough information about the operational schedule to time the decoy wave precisely. Defense is harder than offense when the offense has chosen its moment with this degree of patience. What would you have done differently, commanding the Volga region air defense sector on the night of June 14th? That question is not rhetorical. The answer reveals whether you see what Russia missed. The decoy was not the threat. The silence after the decoy was. Real tactics, real consequences. War Vector. Subscribe to War Vector, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The next video looks at how Ukraine's naval drone program has continued to reshape the Black Sea strategic balance through mid-2026, and why the lessons from the Volga strike apply directly to maritime infrastructure targeting. The steppe around the Volga Relay Center is quiet now. The antenna towers that stood 60 meters above it are gone. The encrypted traffic that once flowed through this facility still needs somewhere to go, and Russian engineers are working to give it somewhere. But the 43 technicians who were on duty that night know something their command structure is still processing. 1,400 kilometers is no longer a safe distance. The wrecks of the antenna arrays remain. Silent reminders that modern warfare punishes the assumption of sanctuary without mercy. Stay vigilant.